Are you feeling really confused about whether you should buy right now or whether you should rent? Because right now the media comes out and says prices are at record highs, interest rates are starting to fall, but equally we've got a rental crisis and it's going to be so hard to rent a property. In this video, I'm going to share with you exactly what my thoughts are around what is best for you in terms of wealth generation, whether it's to buy a property now or whether you should just wait and go and rent. I'm going to also share with you what rent vesting is all about in 2025 and whether it's still a viable solution come 2026. So if you're interested in what my thoughts are, then definitely keep watching. Hey guys, my name's Ravi and welcome back to Personal Finance with Ravi Sharma. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button because I talk about real estate, personal development, and all things financial freedom. Right now we have record prices when it comes to housing, and we also have a bunch of incentives that got announced as part of the federal budget, but I'm not sure how many of those would actually get approved. In amongst all of that, we have a rental crisis that in some parts of Australia are just getting worse. So you might be thinking, maybe I should just buy. Or maybe you're part of the crew that unfortunately due to our upbringings think that renting is for poor people and rent is dead money. So there's no point in doing that. Coming from someone like myself who has invested in property for the last 11 years, and I've helped over 1,000 clients buy property for themselves and scale up portfolios past 5 properties themselves, I continue to rent even today. So I'm a rent vester. And I was one of the first guys that came out saying that yes, rent vesting is okay, and I'm going to explain to you what the concept is. Since then, there's probably a bunch of content creators out there that talk about these things, and that's great because it's probably the biggest wealth hack that you can have in your 20s and 30s, especially if you're taking this seriously. If you try and do a bit of both, you're not going to end up anywhere near. So what you'll probably see is one of those bell curves where the majority of people are in the middle, which is they try and justify their moves and say, no, this is okay, but they end up living the average life. Some people that take unbelievable amounts of risk and it sometimes pays off. And then there's others like myself that think, okay, if I look at this logically and I can kick the can down the road, I don't need instant gratification. I might find myself in a position where I can retire by 40, 45, maybe 50, depending on where you start. Now, I bought my first property at 21, and I can tell you now I was shit scared and I had little to no knowledge at all. So if you're starting in your 20s, having someone like myself talk to you about these things in over 1,000 videos on this channel is definitely going to help you. Now, the Courier Mail actually highlighted that there's been an increase of 21.4% of investor loans coming from first home buyers. That means there's more than 10,000 people that are now becoming rent investors. And this is actually very pleasing because what it means is that people are realizing more and more that just going ahead and buying something just to purely live in is actually a death trap. You're getting into a mortgage for a place you don't actually like, and you convince yourself that at least I'm on the property ladder. But what does it take to get onto the property ladder in 2025? Well, it's all of your upfront costs, which can actually weigh up quite a lot, and it definitely affects your borrowing capacity. This is why it's so important you get the right advice from the right people. For example, most mortgage brokers, I'm going to say more than 90% of them, actually only help people to purchase their first property. It's usually their own principal place of residence, and then once you go ahead and sell that to buy another one, that's what they specialize in. Now we've got a lot more brokers, and it's increasing, which is great, but they come in with the depth of knowledge around how to go and effectively build wealth through real estate. And it's not just real estate, it's understanding how the modern day investor works. Because as a modern day investor myself, I don't invest just in real estate. You might have some Bitcoin, you might have some shares, you might be in ETFs, you might have your own business. So now you need to be adapting to the times. And unfortunately, most people don't know how this works and they can't give you the adequate advice either. So you might be thinking, okay, I've been saving up for a while and I might be at that 80K mark or the 100K mark. And there's now so many incentives like first homeowner grants, I can get stamp duty removals and things like that. I should just go and buy my own place, right? Well, no, because if you go ahead and let's assume you live in Sydney, you might have a budget that allows you to borrow up to maybe 500K. So you can buy a place for $550,000. You've got to ask yourself, what can you actually buy for $550,000 in Sydney? It might be an apartment that's close to the city. It might be a townhouse that's further out west, maybe 30 to 40Ks out of the city, but it's very slim pickings. Now, it does change if you're living in Melbourne and you might be able to get a unit that's closer to the city. And again, it differs if you're in Perth or you're in Brisbane. But the main thing is that you're not actually using the 550K to get into a house. And what we've seen traditionally is houses do outperform units in most locations, especially in these massive capital cities. And the reason for that is because when a developer comes in, they look at a piece of land and they say, okay, on this same piece of land, I can build 4 houses or 8 duplexes or possibly 10 villas or townhouses, but I could actually go and build 400 units. And so as a developer, depending on their size, they're saying, well, I'm gonna make more profit off this land by doing that. And so what happens is in these high dense areas, you're gonna have people come in, developers come in, and they're gonna build out towers of these units. And those units are gonna be the ones that you pick up at 500 or 550K. You could say I've got a property in Sydney, but is it really unique? And that is what will cause you to get capital growth. And if you're getting into the property market and you're hoping for capital growth, well, firstly, hope's not a strategy. But if you are buying that, the idea is that you wanna get wealthy from it. You've invested money into it in the hope that it grows. And that's why you've bought the property in the first place. Otherwise, if you knew that you had to put up all of these upfront costs, you purchase the property and it doesn't go up in value, would you not have been better off just renting a place? You would be. And this is why we need to think critically about what our decision-making process looks like. It's so easy to go, well, okay, I live in Sydney, I've got enough of a deposit, the government's told me I can get these incentives, let me just go down the road to an area that I think I know of, and I'll just buy an apartment. I'll live in there, I'll get the benefits, and then I've got a property. And I can tick it off my bucket list and say, okay, well, you know what? I don't feel so bad. I'm not renting anymore. Renting's for poor people. I don't do that anymore. I've got my own place, but at what cost? Now let's break down some costs. If you're purchasing a 550K property, if you're looking at a 10% deposit, you're looking at about $55,000 just to get into that property. And then all of your other expenses that may pop up. And while most people think that's the hardest part is actually what happens after that. Because now, for the next 30 years, you're guaranteed to pay down that loan. And what it means is that you're living in that property and you're paying down a mortgage. And what happens is when you look at all those numbers and you figure out how much do I actually get left with versus when I was renting, you're gonna find out it's actually better to have rented that same property than it is to have bought that property. And I wanna show you an example right now. Okay, so what I've done here is I've gone to Ashfield, which if you aren't familiar with is a few Ks out from the city. So it's the inner west of Sydney. And I chose Ashfield because I went to school there. So I thought that's the first place that comes to mind. And it is quite nice to live there. Now, if I was to look at rental properties there, I'm looking at 1-bedders and 2-bedders and I can see what's coming up. Now, if I look for something a little bit older, I can rent something for about $540 a week. If I look for something that's bigger, which here it seems like it's more of a top floor penthouse, potentially 3 bedrooms, it's $1,200. But if I'm looking at something that might be a little newer, like this one, potentially got renovated, but it looks quite nice. Now here, I would be renting it for $600 a week. Now, $600 a week, you multiply that by 52, it works out to be just over $30,000 a year. So that's how much it would cost me to rent this place, and I have no upfront cost apart from my rental bond, which is usually 4 weeks. Now, if I compare that to 1-bedders in Ashfield that I could purchase right now, I can see a newer one, this might be a bigger one though, $730,000. We're looking here, $620,000, $650,000. Let's look at the lower end being $620,000. Now, if I was to go ahead and borrow for the $620,000, I would go in and put a 10% deposit down, which is usually about $60,000 in this case. And that means I'm borrowing about $560,000. So we go and put that into the calculator. And here we've got an interest rate of 6.5%. You probably can find an interest rate that's probably lower at about 6%. So let's find that. What we can see is our weekly repayments will be $775 a week. Now this is principal plus interest. So we're gonna get onto that in a second. Straight off the bat, what we're looking at is potentially a difference of $150 to $200 per week that I'm now saving by not having bought this property. But if you want a like for like, because the repayments we're making here are principal plus interest. So interest is the cost of borrowing that money. Principal is just for savings. You're paying down your own loan, so you shouldn't really take that into consideration. So if you were going interest only, you might have your interest rate change a little bit and it might be 6%, it might be slightly higher. But in this case, we're gonna leave it the same. It works out that your interest only repayments for 1 year would be $2,800 per month. Now, what does that look like per week? It usually works out to be about $700 per week anyway. So what you'll find is you're still out of pocket more than $100 a week just purely because you wanted to buy this. Now, if you're looking at like for like, rent versus interest only can be viewed as the same as rent because it's just the cost of borrowing. It's not that you've gone out and you're paying down your loan because that would be principal plus interest. So even in this case, if your repayments are about $700 per week or renting the same place for about $600 per week, you can see the difference. It's about $5,000 a year. Now that might not sound like a lot to you, but what did it cost for you to get into that place? Well, you've got the 10% deposit, you might get away with not having to pay stamp duty, but you have your costs like pest and build inspections, conveyancing, and then you have your ongoing repayments like your strata, you might have some council rates, water rates, and things like that. So when you actually are comparing like for like in this particular suburb, it makes no goddamn sense to be actually going and buying something versus renting that place. If it were up to me, I would rent first. So I would go into this area and say, okay, it's gonna cost me about $600 per week to rent. Now, in my mind, I'm negative $30,000 because I've had to go rent this place. But now I still have all of my cash and I can use that cash to go out and purchase in another area where I believe the growth will be greater. So not only am I saving on a weekly basis, which means my lifestyle is probably not as affected, but I'm also in a position where I've now bought a property based on data and statistics to know that this area is going to grow far better than the area that I was going to purchase in anyway. I'm most likely purchasing a house or a townhouse that's in an area that has scarcity, which means I'm getting probably 7 to 10% worth of growth. Even though I'm paying $30,000 a year or thereabouts for rent, I have to live somewhere. So I'm doing that in an area I like, and then I can go and invest somewhere else where the numbers make sense. And on a 500K property, which is what I would probably be able to purchase, I'm now building wealth. And at 7% growth, that means in year one, I've grown by $35,000 in that property. So that pretty much offsets anything I'm paying towards the rent. Although on a cash flow basis, you can't realize that, but it does mean that your net worth is actually increasing even though you're renting in an area you want to live in and not having fallen for what everyone else talks about, which is just buy your place, it doesn't matter what it is. Over time, what you're gonna realize is you'll have equity in that property, and if you decide in 2 years' time you don't really like Ashfield anymore, you could pick up and leave. Whereas if you had bought that apartment, and I've seen this play out plenty of times, where if you had bought that place, in 2 years' time, if you decided to leave, guess what? There's transaction fees that you're gonna have to pay, and now you don't get any first homeowner grants for the next place you purchase. So now net, you're probably going backwards. And if it happens to be because you don't have any cash remaining or an emergency fund, and you have to sell that property, you're not gonna look at whether the market's strong or whether it's the best time to sell. You're gonna sell when you have to sell because you're forced to. And this idea of financial freedom is freedom of choice. If you're getting stuck with a property like that, just because someone told you it's a good idea to do it, I would urge you to rethink your decisions, especially in your 20s when life changes. You might get with a partner that doesn't even like Ashfield. You might find yourself getting over Ashfield and want to live in Brisbane. You might want to live overseas. And these are the things that you need to consider as we go through this next phase. And if you do this well in your 20s and 30s, and why I harp on about it is because I know the power of compounding interest. If you do this well and you purchase the first few properties well, I promise you, in 5 to 10 years' time, you're sitting on more wealth than you would have accumulated if you just had saved all of that money and followed the crowd. I hope you guys have got some value out of this. I know rents are increasing and it's hard to find a rental property, but if you can manage to go down this path, find a rental property that makes sense for you, go out there and outsource all of the research to go out and find the best brokers, best accountants, and best buyer's agent to go and find the property and source it for you, that's the direction that I would be taking. If you need help with any of that, I'm gonna leave links in the description box below. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, just smash that subscribe button and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks, guys.